All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Again, for those of you just joining us, welcome. I'm glad that you could join us this morning. The first thing I've got to say is I am incredibly excited about this webinar. It's one of my favorite ones of mine that we have done because I think it has some unbelievable power to it. What we're going to be talking about today in looking at advanced revenue cycle analytics have a great opportunity for White Plume and for our clients to realize significant additional return on investment on the product that you already have installed. That means we've got an opportunity for additional savings without another implementation, without a lot of change, without a lot of risk, and without a lot of cost. And that's a big win in healthcare IT, which has been a difficult past, 5, 6, 7 years, right? We've been in this meaningful use era where people bought a lot of software that they don't want or that they don't use very well. Doctors are tired and feeling burned out, and this is an opportunity for a victory. This is an opportunity for an easy win, and I'm excited to talk to you about that today. Here's what we're going to do over the next 45 minutes or so. I want to make sure that we spend some time saying, okay, well, what are these advanced revenue cycle analytics? What are we talking about there? What type of data can we get at? What type of information can we find? And why is that important? So what kind of data can we get? And what can we do with it? Are really the two big questions. And the best way that I know how to share that with you is just tell you some of the early success stories of what we've been doing, of what we've found working together with clients on this, what they've been able to do, what that's meant for them, and what that might mean for you. I'm going to share some of those stories. Everybody's is a little bit different. That's been one of the interesting things at looking at this data, is that we find opportunities for improvement almost everywhere. But they're different from one group to the next. So you might hear some things, parts of it that really resonate with you, and parts of it that you say, we don't have that particular problem. But what we're trying to do is identify some great opportunities for improvement. So we'll share some of those stories with you. I think you'll be excited about what we're going to see here. And then we'll talk about what are the next steps, where do we go from here? And then I'll certainly leave time for questions and answers at the end. You can use the questions panel if you've got questions as we go. Shelly's going to try to answer as many of those as she can. We'll try to answer all of them that are broadly applicable afterwards, but there may be some that we need to follow up offline with you if they're really specific to your practice or not broadly applicable. So that's what I hope to accomplish, and hopefully by the time that we finish today, you'll see how this is a tool that we can leverage to gain some additional return on investment out of Excella Smart. So when we talk about this, we've had a lot of focus over the past couple of years on how we're recapturing charge data through Excella Capture, through your EHR, through Excella Mobile. We've had a lot of energy and focus there. So we're going to spend a lot of our time looking at today is on the revenue cycle side, specifically what's happening in Excella Smart. But one of the things that I want to do before we get going, just to get your minds in the right place and to get kind of a good benchmark as to what's happening out there, I'm going to launch our first poll question. And the question is this: when was the last time that you did some training for your Excella Smart users? For some of you, you might not have done this since your initial go-live training, and that's okay. And if you did it in the last 12 months, was that something that you did internally? Or was that something that you had White Plume come on site and do that type of training for you? Or if it was more than 12 months ago, but more recently than your initial go-live, was that something that you did internally, or was that something that White Plume did on site for you? So all you have to do is pick the one that kind of best describes your situation. Just go ahead and lock that in, and I'll close the poll here in just a second. But what we're seeing for many people, it's been a long time since they've done that. Or if they've done it, they've had a user that trained another user. And sometimes we see different results in what they're able to do with AccelaSmart as a result of that training. So we want to spend some time putting some emphasis, putting some focus on that today. So thanks again for participating and for voting in the poll. That is always helpful. It's great to get that kind of feedback, and hopefully that makes the webinar more enjoyable for you as well. So when we look at these advanced revenue cycle analytics, what am I talking about? What do I mean when I say that? Well, what we're trying to do is get better visibility into the revenue cycle. What's happening? And not just about denials and claims volume, that sort of thing, but really getting down to a more granular level to look at what's happening in AccelaSmart. What types of changes are we making? What are we doing to try to make the claim go out the door completely and correctly the first time? What are the things that we're having to clean up? And we want to use AccelaSmart as a tool that our doctors don't have to be perfect coders. We don't want to turn our doctors into coders. But we want to make sure that we optimize that process so that you can get the best outcomes from it. And so we're able to drill down and get some provider-specific data, to get some user-specific data, to try to answer questions like this. How many encounters are we having to touch and change in AccelaSmart each day? What does that percentage look like? How does that compare across my providers? Where might there be some additional training that needs to be done? Where might there be some processes that we can automate? What are the changes that we're actually making most frequently? Are there any patterns there? Is there anything that we can learn from that type of information? And what can we do to make that better? When I look at the changes that I'm making, are they mostly to CPT codes? Are they units? Are they modifiers? Are they diagnoses? Am I having to change the referring physician because the check-in staff didn't add that to the encounter correctly? Which codes am I adding most frequently that we're not capturing? What are the ones that I'm deleting that are getting put on that encounter that shouldn't be deleted, that shouldn't be on that encounter? These are the types of questions we want to ask. And not just having the data is helpful, but we want to turn that data into actionable information. From a productivity standpoint, how many encounters are we processing? How quickly are we doing that? How many encounters can my users process in an hour? And how does that compare to other White Plume clients? Which of my AccelaSmart users are making the most coding changes? Maybe some are making more changes than others because they're working on the surgery charges and your other users are working on the office charges. Again, we're trying to provide better visibility into what's happening in the revenue cycle, what changes are being made in AccelaSmart so that we can make improvements of that process to deliver you the best outcomes so that you can get the claim paid completely and correctly the first time and do that in as efficient workflow as possible. Do I have doctors that require more coding changes than others? Right? Is there anything that I can do to make that better? There's a lot more questions that you want to ask when you start getting your hands on this data. It's very, very valuable. The conversations that we're having with these clients are very, very valuable. And so when I talk about advanced revenue cycle analytics, those are some of the questions that we're trying to answer. And why that's important from a big picture perspective is, as we make the inevitable shift from volume-based reimbursement to value-based reimbursement, we're going to need better revenue cycle data. We're going to need to capture better data, and we're going to need to have a more optimized revenue cycle, right, so that we can answer some of those questions. optimize our process so we can handle some of the additional work that's coming down the road. But it's not just about having data, because there's a difference between data and information. We want to be able to turn that data into information. Right? Data is ubiquitous. It's almost overwhelming sometimes. There's so much data out there that we don't know what to do with it. And the distinction I would make between data and information is that information tells you the story. Information is actionable. We can put that into process. We can do something with it. So we want to get better revenue cycle data, better insight into our process so that we can make it better. Because if we can make it better, we can deliver better revenue cycle outcomes. And that's what we're trying to do with AccelaSmart in the first place, so that we make sure that the claims are paid completely and correctly the first time, right? Now, the thing we've got to be careful about when we do this is many times we can look at the changes that we're having to make for the physicians and say, you know what, if we could just get them to do that correctly the first time, if we could just turn them into coders, we wouldn't have to do all of this on the back end of the revenue cycle. But we don't want to turn our doctors into coders. That's not what they are best at. We need them seeing and taking care of our patients. How do we do that? Minimize the manual intervention, automate as much of this as possible to generate the best revenue cycle outcomes. That's what we're trying to do with these analytics. Right? Hopefully that gives you an idea from a big picture standpoint of what we're talking about, what we're trying to do. Now I'm going to shift gears and jump into the details for you and show you some examples of what we've been able to pull out of these analytics packages that are real world examples that other clients are using today, what they've done with the data, how they've transformed that into information and generated better revenue cycle outcomes as a result. Again, I'm going to go through a few different examples. Some of these may or may not be what you'd expect to find in your practice, but hopefully they start to give you a picture of what we're talking about. All right, here's the first one. De-identifying the information so you can't tell who is the guilty party here. But this is one of the parts of this analytics report that shows you the provider-specific breakdown. It shows me all of my providers, how many encounters were in this reporting period, how many CPT codes were on those encounters, and what types of changes we're having to make for each of those providers, and it's sorted high to low. All right? And what I'm going to focus on is not the top one, who's only seeing 3 encounters over this 30-day period, but I'm going to look at these next 3 down. And the reason why I'm looking at those is because they're relatively high volume in a short period of time, and we're making more changes to CPT codes for those 3 providers than we are for everybody else. So they're the outlier. And so what the data shows us is, this may be a place we want to spend a little bit of time, we want to pay a little bit of attention, and we want to drill down and get some more information to find out what's happening there. And it turns out what was happening, this particular client, these 3 providers are subspecialists. And they hadn't updated their electronic super bill recently for them. And so there was, in particular, a few CPT codes that they used very, very frequently that weren't on their form. And what that means for the doctor is the doctor was having to go somewhere else on the form to a free text section, to type in the description, or an abbreviation for the description, that then a coder downstream would get the rule firing in AccelaSmart to look in the manual entry required section and add the CPT code to the encounter. This didn't cause a denied claim. It didn't cause a missed revenue opportunity because they were capturing it. But what it caused was additional clicks for their doctors. it would take them 6 extra clicks for the doctor, clicks and keystrokes, 6 extra clicks for the doctor to enter this information rather than just the 1 click it would have taken had they optimized their form correctly. And so the solution was to update their form. We have the data now to know exactly what needs to be added for those particular providers. If we need to create them their own tab, let's do it. If we need to add that to an existing tab, let's do that. Because when we put that solution in place, it was saving these subspecialists 4.4 clicks per encounter. Right? Now, I know I told you it was 6 clicks, but they weren't doing it on every single encounter. Right? So we had to do a little bit of math to figure that out. But it was saving the doctors, these 3 subspecialists, 4.4 clicks on every single encounter on average. And then on the revenue cycle side, it was saving their coders over an hour per day by optimizing the form correctly to reduce the manual entry that was necessary. So this is just one example where we see clients have opportunities to optimize their form in Accelicapture, to optimize their templates in their EHR, to make sure that we're capturing the right data in as few clicks as possible, and making sure that the claim is paid correctly and completely the first time. That's one example of what we've seen from these analytics packages that have pointed us to some places where we can make some improvements. Let me show you another one. Here's a different section of this data that looks at the types of changes that are being made in AccelaSmart. And on this particular client, when we started to review this and talk through it, what we noticed was that gray area for other procedure change was much higher than what we had seen at other client sites. Right? They were making, right here, they were making nearly 900 changes in a 30-day period. And what was happening, what was going on here is they had CPT codes that were coming in the wrong RVU order. And so the coders in AccelaSmart were having to stop and review that to make sure that they got resequenced correctly. And they were manually resequencing so that they'd be in the correct RVU order. So what we're able to do with them is look at some scripting and some tools that are available in the interface to make sure that we got those in the right order. And that happened every single time, and we automated that process rather than having them do that manually. And by doing that, that saved their revenue cycle team 2 hours per day. So 10 hours a week. And that was for a relatively small practice, 10 providers in that group. The same type of problem is happening in a 30-doctor group. You know, now you're talking about 6 hours a day that can be saved and reallocated to other tasks. So as we start to deal with MIPS, as we start to deal with risk-adjusted coding, right, as we make the shift from volume to value, we're able to take some of those resources and do more without hiring additional employees, gaining additional return on investment out of AccelaSmart. And this analytics tool helps point us to where those opportunities are. Let me show you a third scenario that we found that looks at the data a little bit differently. This section of the analytics looks at specifically the diagnosis changes that are being made in AccelaSmart and drilling down to the code-specific level to see which diagnosis codes are being added or deleted most frequently, and how many times that happened over the reporting period. And the thing that stood out to me when we were looking at this with a client was that that top diagnosis that was being added was happening much more frequently than any of the other diagnosis changes that they were making. Far and away, the #1 code that was being added, 804 times in this particular instance. And so a lot of times when you start to look at this information, the question comes, why? Well, what's happening? Well, tell me the story behind that. And here's what we found. We found that this particular client wanted to track their no-show patients. And they had a dummy CPT code that they used so that they could track that in their practice management system. But in order to get that to post across the interface, they needed a diagnosis code linked to the CPT code. Because if they didn't have that, the CPT code wouldn't post correctly. So here's what was happening. The front desk staff would select the code for no-show encounter. But they wouldn't pick any diagnosis codes. They wouldn't pick a dummy diagnosis code. The revenue cycle team had asked them to do that, but they got busy. They had a lot going on, very busy practice, and they'd forget. And so they had coders behind the scenes reviewing this, finding the validation message in AccelaSmart, and manually adding that Z code, Z02.89, to the dummy code for the CPT no-show. And they did that 804 times. So what we recommended was we can automatically add, you want to use that dummy code, that Z code every time with the CPT code for no-show? We can automate that. We can build that into the electronic superbill so that that happens automatically. You don't have to worry about retraining the front desk or them forgetting and then spending expensive coding time on the back end to clean that up. And so we took their #1 problem and we're able to automate that. And they're able to spend that coding time doing some of the E&M audits that they wanted to do that they never could get to. Again, I want to show you these examples so that you can see where the data becomes very valuable and shows you where to look, shows you opportunities for improvement. And sometimes that's overwhelming. There's a lot of information. You know there are lots of opportunities for improvement. You don't have to do all of that at once. Let's pick some of the biggest challenges and work on those. Right? Okay, I hope those examples are helpful. I'm going to show you another one in just a minute. But I want to give you zoom out and give you the big picture of what we're talking about. Right? Whenever you look at productivity in AccelaSmart, there are two things that we have to do. We've got to process encounters, and what's critical is the speed at which we can do that. How many encounters per hour can we process? It's looking at throughput. But we also have to make changes. We have to make changes to make sure that it's coded correctly. And we know that there's a balancing act to that. It's a trade-off. The more changes that you make, the longer that's going to take you. Fewer changes that you make, the faster you're going to be able to process those encounters. And so what we typically see looking across the client base is we notice that there's a trend. We can draw a line to know what that average looks like. Okay, and what we found is that there's a pretty clear trend line. And here's what it looks like. So most people, if they're changing about 20% of their encounters, are able to process close to 200 encounters per hour. And if you've got to change 70 or 80%, you're only going to be able to process 50 encounters per hour. And we see some clients are below that line, some clients are above that line. Some individual users do better than others, maybe based on the types of encounters that they process, maybe based on how well their doctors code. There's a lot that goes into this. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is help move you from where you are, if you're below that line, to closer to it. And if you're above that line, trying to move you up even further above that line. Because the better you're able to work through AccelaSmart, the more efficient that revenue cycle will be. You'll be able to make sure that everything is coded correctly. The claim's going to get paid completely and correctly the first time, but you'll also be able to do that in a shorter period of time. And the faster you can do that, the more powerful AccelaSmart is for you, and the more time you have to deal with all of the other things that are coming at our practices right now. Just share with you kind of a quick example of what this looks like. You can see we have clients that are all over the place. Each of these blue dots is a different practice. And so you can see there are some that are able to process 300 encounters per hour. And there are some that are able to process 200, and there are some that are able to process 150. But that's what the average looks like. And we want to use this information, use this data to identify the opportunities of where you can work smarter, not harder, where you can deliver better results for your practice, and equip you with the information to be able to share that with your doctors when it's appropriate, to show them how well your revenue cycle process works, how hard your revenue cycle staff works, and how even though you're outperforming your peers, you're still making constant improvements. Let me share with you one more example of what we've seen in the advanced revenue cycle analytics. And this is something that we've seen in almost every single one that we've done so far. Part of the analytics looks at my individual users. And this has a lot of information on it. But one of the things that I look at is that first column. What that shows me is, I've got 8 different staff that are working encounters in AccelaSmart, but 2 of them are doing much less volume than the others. Maybe that's a manager, maybe that's a part-time employee, maybe that's a new employee. But 6 of them are really doing the bulk of the work. And then when I look at the bottom half of this, I can see that I've got 3 users that are able to process encounters at a much, much higher rate than everybody else. And what I notice is they're making the same amount of changes that the other staff is making. So it's not that they're faster because they are ignoring some of the rules, they're not making a lot of changes. The coding data that they're getting from the doctors is much better. What we found is these are the 2 users that use the application the most. They've had the best training, they've had the most practice, and they've identified some best practices that enable them to move very, very quickly through their batch and produce excellent results at the same time. And so what this practice did was say, okay, how do we use this information to equip and empower my users to leverage the best practices that we've identified? because this is the biggest opportunity that we have in this particular practice. Let me show you what this means in a hypothetical situation. If I've got these same 8 users that we talked about on the previous screen, I just took out some of the other data elements. You can see how much time these users are spending each day in ExcelisSmart. And so in this particular example, you can see user 7 is spending the most time in ExcelisSmart, but they're only doing half the volume of encounters that user 1 and user 2 are doing. This is not to try to beat up user 7. What we're trying to find out is, what are user 1 and user 2 doing that we need to teach our other users? What are the best practices that can be leveraged? Because if I can take those same employees and get them all up to the productivity that we know that's possible with the first user, look what that does to the hours per day spent in ExcelisSmart. That saves this practice 10 hours of staff time per day. And what we find is usually there's not something that is magical or impossible to replicate in those best users. They've got a bit more experience, they've had a bit more training, and they're leveraging best practices. How do we do that for the other users? Because if we can do that, and we can save 10 hours of revenue cycle time per day, I've almost cut that time in half for this particular client. And they didn't have to do a new install. They didn't have to take on a lot of risk or spend a lot of time to do that. They're just taking better advantage of what they're already doing today, what they already have in-house. And we have found this type of opportunity exists 9 times out of 10. So what we would recommend when we look at this is thinking about this type of analytics information. Is it helpful? Is it valuable? How frequently do you want to have access to this? Here's what we found so far. Some clients kind of want to do it once to see what they think, see what it's like. Most clients at this point are wanting to run it on a quarterly basis so that they can run the analytics, decide where they want to put their emphasis, where they want to make some changes, where they want to make some improvements, and then run the analytics again so that they can see what kind of impact it had, and to focus on where their next area for improvement might be. Again, we do have some clients that want to run that monthly as well, which we can certainly accommodate, but the majority of people thus far have wanted to do that on a quarterly basis. And I would recommend using that analytics package to figure out where there are places to make incremental improvements. And your client account execs can work with you on this to say, okay, here's what we see. We think we need to make these types of forms changes. We think we need to build in these types of scripts. Maybe there's an opportunity to better use your custom rules, because it looks like for the changes that you're making, you've got users that are stopping and looking at every single encounter rather than using the rules to manage that on an exception-only basis. We have people that are stopping to clean up unspecified codes because they haven't leveraged custom scenarios appropriately to make sure they can get the most specific code the first time. And there are significant training best practices opportunities where we can share, here's what we've seen from other clients who've tried to fix this type of problem. That's what I would recommend as a next step. And let me do this, ask you this question as our next poll question is, how frequently do you think you might want to look at something like this. Never is obviously a choice. If you don't think that's helpful, only one time, I might want to do that, but then we probably won't do it that frequently. Do we want to do it once a quarter? Do we think that makes sense? Some people may want to do that every month. And if you're not sure, there's obviously an option for that as well. What we typically find, again, is thus far most of our people have wanted to do that on a quarterly basis. It looks like it's pretty evenly tied right now on our poll results today. Some people wanting to do that every month, some people wanting to do that every quarter. We think that's certainly a good place to start, is to jump out ahead of that and start to try to make some of these types of improvements. So thanks for participating in the poll. We really appreciate it. Every quarter just jumped ahead of every month. And then some of you out there are not sure yet. Okay, so what have we talked about? We talked about wanting to capture better revenue cycle data, better analytics, better visibility into what's happening in our revenue cycle. What types of changes are we making in AccelaSmart? We've got to have the data to do that. And then we need to be able to turn that into actionable information, because what we're looking for, where are the opportunities to improve? Where can we improve our process? Where can we improve our outcomes? That's what we want to work with you on, to say, how do we help you get fewer denials? How do we make sure we prevent denials before they ever happen? How do we make this process more automated than it is today? How do we get faster throughput? How do we process the same volume of encounters with the same results, with the same amount of changes, but in less time, so that we can reallocate some of that time to the additional work that's being put on us as healthcare gets more and more complicated? Right? We want to provide more value to you out of AccelaSmart every single year. We think that AccelaSmart should be more valuable to you this year than it was last year. And that's what we're trying to do with these types of analytics. Right? Now, the next poll question, I'm going to give you the follow-up information request, and then I'll open it up for Q&A. In the information request, it allows you to multi-select in that poll question. So if you want multiple pieces of information, if there are multiple parts of this that will be helpful for you, feel free to multi-select there. Running this analytics package does take some time on our side. That's not something that is automatic, or that we can't do 500 of those a day. So know that there can be some delay on that, and there is a cost to the analytics package. It depends on your provider size, but just to give you a ballpark, the analytics package for a 14 doctor practice is $900. So relatively inexpensive to get that level of visibility into the revenue cycle. But want you to know that as well. We can, if you've got specific, hey, I can't go through all the provider sizes today, but just to give you a ballpark of what we're talking about. But if you want that detailed information, that's one of the options in the follow-up poll. So let me go ahead and launch that for you. Again, you can multi-select if you've got multiple things that are in there that you want. This information will be shared with your client account exec, so they can get you the PowerPoint slides, they can get you the recorded version of the webinar, they can get you the quote for the analytics package if you want to do that. So pick the ones that are appropriate for you, and we'll get that over to you as quickly as we can. We'll try to get most of that out today. It usually takes a few hours to get the recording published out to YouTube, but we'll get that to you as quickly as we can. So pick out what's appropriate for you, and we'll get that information over to you. And I'm going to get Shelly to help me out on the questions panel with what questions we've had so far that are broadly applicable for the group. What did I miss? What did we not cover?
We did not have any that were applicable to everyone. Had a couple that were specific to a group,
Okay.
But we handled those offline.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Shelley. I hope that means that this was helpful and clear, not confusing and murky. Here's what we'll do. We will leave the questions panel up for just a few minutes. If you've got questions that you haven't asked that come to your mind, feel free to put those in there, and we'll make sure that we get those back to you. If you have not filled out the polling question on the follow-up information, please do that so that we will get you that information. And if you've got, don't forget to take 30 seconds, please, to fill out those survey questions. That's hugely helpful for us. We would love to be able to make this better as we go forward. Any suggestions for improvement that you have, or any comments on what was most helpful for you is very valuable to us, and I appreciate that greatly. So thank you in advance for that. But thank you for your time this morning. If that concludes all of our questions, we'll try to end a few minutes early and give you some time back in your day. But thank you again. Thank you for being clients. Thank you for the pleasure of getting to work with you. We certainly appreciate that and do not take it for granted. Hope you have a great rest of your Tuesday. Bye-bye.